Good evening. Welcome to Backstory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein. Our topic for tonight is the battle over property assessment in the Princeton Borough and Township. I have some very important guests with me. Starting on my right is Jim Firestone, who owned a Princeton brokerage firm for over 25 years, knew the real estate trends over time, and participated in correcting the revaluation in the 1980s with Carl Light, oh, I knew Carl Light, and Bob Dougherty. Jim Firestone has the distinction of having been born in Princeton. He's always had a concern for Witherspoon Jackson residents, who many of them he grew up with. And he is one of the important people in this tax assessment debate. Sitting on to my immediate right is Jim Floyd. Jim is the first African-American mayor of Princeton Township. He's now retired, but he takes pride in convening meetings at the Witherspoon Jackson neighborhood at the Mount Pisgah Church and the First Baptist Church. He's being feted this fall as the first Floyd Jazz Fest on Sunday, October 17th at the Nassau Inn. I'd like to be there. Its purpose is to endow a scholarship fund at Mercer County Community College, where Jim has served on the Board of Trustees for 20 years. I've been teaching there for almost that long, I think. It's also a commemoration of his and his wife, Fanny. And now to my left is Alan Hegedus. Now, Alan is a retired CEO of a major corporation, Phillips Lighting. He was recently president of the Princeton School Board after being head of the Finance Committee for 10 years. He was their numbers man. Okay, gentlemen, I see here from the Princeton Packets online, the Central Jersey, that there was several town hall meetings. One must have been July 29th or July 30th. The Princeton Borough and Council and the Township Committee sent a letter to the appraisal system formally requesting that the firms provide a detailed explanation of the methodology it used to complete the recent evaluation of both communities, reevaluation. The problem seems to be that people feel it's unfair, there's inequities. They feel that the people who are of lower income are being somehow discriminated against, and people of a more upper income are somehow being favored. How did this all start? Why don't we start with Jim Floyd? How did this all start, Jim? You got involved first.
Thank you, Joan.
Yeah.
Early on, I got involved. Let me back up just a moment or two to the Witherspoon Jackson neighborhood meetings that you alluded to, that I've been very much part of. Incidentally, I know some of our audience will ask, well, what's Jackson? Jackson happens to be the street that was eliminated during the early days of the Palmer Square expansion, should I say, and if you now ride up Paul Robeson Place, that was formerly Jackson Street. Okay. And if you are an astute person, you'll notice that's virtually an OG curve, and when you get to that part of the curve closest to First Baptist Church, you'll notice that Palmer Square benefits with their current expansion. My involvement grew out of one of our meetings with the Witherspoon Jackson group, at which time many of the residents in attendance were not only questioning what they'd received regarding the new revaluation, but also the fact that they totally didn't understand it. And we invited members of the governing bodies from both the township and the borough. And I must say that many of our residents were totally disappointed because the answers were either not complete or not forthcoming at all. In fact, there were those who alluded to the fact that since it's a neighborhood that may be gentrified, why worry about what the taxes are going to be? And that, of course, aroused much anger in the neighborhood.
I can understand that. Did they explain what they meant by gentrifying the neighborhood? What did they say, imply that would mean?
That not even slowly. Normally you'd say slowly but surely things are changing, but
Rapidly.
in this instance they were referring to the fact that there are developers coming into the neighborhood, buying these properties, and in turn either building mega mansions or buildings or structures that were not comparable to the rest of the neighborhood. Now, gentrification allegedly would be the intrusion of those developers or folk who were not immediately from the neighborhood. And I think what one has to really understand, many of these houses that have been converted are rental properties. And unfortunately, they carry the stigma, although deserved, of being overcrowded entities and very little attention being given to them from the standpoint of maintenance. So we have both, not only the acquisition of properties and the construction of a building that's not comparable, but the denigration of the community by these absentee landlords who foster the overcrowding. And someplace along the way, there may have been a price offered to the seller that was somewhat higher than what normally would have been offered.
So you get in on the ground floor of this discussion and you say something is rotten in the state of New Jersey, or words to that effect. And
yes, words to that effect, and some words I can't repeat, but
okay.
Quite frankly, the elected officials present couldn't explain or wouldn't explain the process or why there were such distortions in the result that many of the properties in the neighborhood had multiples of taxation that were just unbearable.
So there was a jacking up of the assessments of properties of people of lesser income and lowering of taxes of people who were of higher income. Is that what it added up to?
Yes, yes. We weren't totally aware of the rest of the community. Hence, our decision was not to become incendiary about it, but to join in and find out what was happening generically with the reevaluation process.
Right. So we get now to you, Jim Valentine. You get involved, and you open the door to more of the community, right?
Yes, I did. I first went down there with Jim to the church one morning and saw what the problem was. Then went to a meeting at night where people were really worried about their appeals, and I said to myself, maybe I can do something about this. Maybe I can help these people work on it, because it was in my field of expertise. I was a real estate broker for 30 years, so I knew that I could do something with it. And so I helped the people appeal at night. So I went down with Jim, I guess 3 or 4 nights in a row for 3 or 4 hours and helped people write out their appeals. And the assessor was kind enough at the time to tell me just to get a lot of the people to write to be determined on their applications for their appeals. And so we did that.
What was the significance of writing to be determined?
Well, that's because a lot of people didn't know what to do, and I explained that to the assessor, that they didn't know what to do. He said, well, just put it on it then, just to be determined, and you can work on it until the time of the assessment.
So it's sort of an open case.
Yep, it became an open case, something we could all work on.
Okay, very interesting.
So after that, I began walking, because the people came in like that, I began walking the neighborhoods with them, because I couldn't tell what their house was. So what I had to do was I exited several times, even from the meetings, to go to their houses and looked at where they came from. And in going house to house like that, you really began to understand that there was something wrong that was going on, basically. And we came back, the people made their appeals, and I realized that I had to go and see both of the mayors in town about the errors that were committed in this thing, because there were so many errors. And so I began to categorize the errors. Well, Mayor Trotman and Mayor Miller began walking the area with me.
Good.
And they went through a whole bunch of houses and met the people, which was kind of nice. And Mildred said for me to go back and see if I could find more people who had trouble, and I did. But
Okay. So the picture is beginning to broaden. Now we see that
Yep.
there are more people involved than initially thought. It's
Yep.
not one area, one community, but now
Well-
we've got this picture of
well,
something
this was
happening.
still one community
Yeah.
at that point, but what
Right.
happened was when I made the second walk, I found all these duplexes that had problems in Witherspoon Jackson too.
Right.
And it was 90-degree heat, and it was awfully hard to keep
Yeah.
doing this. So I started making a few phone calls when I saw a greater pattern emerge, and I turned the second study over to the mayors. And the mayors, what ended up happening was these other people started calling me around town because they heard I was involved in it. And this was area 215, which is the area going up Mount Lucas Road back to Ewing, down to the shopping center. And three people from there, Kip Cherry, Dale Mead, and Toby Israel, three or four of them, and John Wheeler's son. All four of them came together and said, our area just isn't working right. And it wasn't quite as bad as Jim's area in terms of the number of egregious things, but a lot of things were off 20 to 30% in terms of taxes. And that becomes large. And then we realized
Yeah.
that it was smaller, older, modest homes were being asked to pay this big increase, and bigger, newer, mega mansion type houses were getting reductions. So in the process of doing this, finally Jenny Crumlier's husband John was making up a mapping the borough, and I have a copy of that map here.
Let's see if we can hold it up. Maybe they can.
let's
I
see
don't know
if
if the
I-
camera can get it. But yes, give it to the. He's going to try to get it on
Here
the
it
camera.
is, yeah. But he made a map of it, and
Is that? Can you get that? No. Maybe you want to explain
Yeah.
what the map
well,
says.
what the map says in short was this section of it, which is Birch and Lee Avenue, is really heavily hit with a lot of houses paying 60% increase in taxes. And the same with the borough section that was next to it, which runs all the way up to Green and Quarry Street. Meanwhile, the western section of town over here, which is Westcott Road and Cleveland Road, were receiving 0 to 30% reductions in their taxes on this. And that didn't make sense to me. We just started to say, well, what in the devil is happening here? Are these two ranging against each other? Or is there some systematic flaws in the way that this assessment is being done? And at first we thought it was the method. Then we realized
it was
it
the
probably
madness.
is not the method. It's the misapplication of the method that was really doing it.
And so then you had to ask the next question, which was why? Why is this happening?
Yeah, we had to ask
Yeah.
why it was happening, and we had to find cases of it around town. So more neighborhoods began to join us. It went from that core area up near Valley Road, all the way over to Franklin, down to Riverside where Tom Pyle is, South Harrison Street, then out to Random Road where the mega mansions were built. And then we found out that the mega mansions on the west end of town really didn't influence things very much at all, because everything there was already $1.5 million or $2 million. So when they built one, it didn't change anything. But it did change it in these other areas. So there was something in the method that was awry in Princeton. For some reason it was not working. And we found many reasons for that. We call those systematic flaws. At that point, I walked over next door with my wife Tina to Stanworth Apartments, right next to Jim's Witherspoon Jackson. And we said, I wonder what's going on over here. And so we walked from house to house to house. There's 153 units there. And we counted up everything on the assessment sheets. And all of a sudden we found out that the base land price there per unit was 1/4 as much, 59,000, as in Jim's Witherspoon Jackson area, which was 217,000. So that meant for that big tract of land that was all on one tract in the university, that they were paying 1/4 of the taxes for their children to go to Princeton schools from that particular subdivision as the people next door in Witherspoon Jackson were paying. We said, can this make sense that they keep saying that they're paying their fair share? We were incensed by it. That's when I called Alan Hedges.
And that is a segue to Alan.
Indeed.
Alan, please explain what you thought, what you're doing.
Well, good. I picked up late in the game compared to Jim, but I too had the sense that something was awry. Anecdotally, talking to neighbors, looking at my own tax bill, etc. Let me step back a little. I recall earlier this year, January, February, I wrote a one-page note to other interested citizens, let's say elected officials included, entitled "The Perfect Storm Coming to Princeton." And what I was then concerned about was the economy, the new governor, Governor Christie, what he faced. That was one. The consolidation of the township as well as the borough as a second element and what that would do. And then the third element of the perfect storm being the reevaluation, not after 10 years, but after 13 years, which was a big unknown at the time. But when you put the three together, there were some things coming. Again, as president of the school board and head of the finance committee, we saw some real tough times coming from the school perspective, which led, by the way, months later, to the single largest reduction of teaching staff and administrative staff in the history of our school system. Yeah. So the fact that we saw a storm coming was one thing. My point is I was sensitized to a coming storm, and therefore when it was brought to my attention that in fact the revaluation was being completed, the work was done. First we got the raw numbers of property values. That looked pretty steeply awry. Later we all got our tax bills that was attached to those assessments, and it really started blowing the top off of everything. Far worse than I even might have suspected or feared back in January under the heading of a perfect storm. So that drew me right into the fray. I left the school board in April, had time on my hands, and was more than happy to get involved with it to see what I can do. And was it really developing as the numbers seemed to indicate? And I recognize that Princeton Borough, principally, although I've been to 3 meetings now, 2 in the township, this week's 1 in the borough, all 3 of which were filled to overflowing, people in the aisles having their tax bills in hand or their assessment papers in hand, having to be gavelled down by the chairman. That this town is seething with what they're now seeing, unlike anything else I've seen in the 30 years I've been in New Jersey.
Wow.
So how does this thing all come together? And then you get into the analysis of the effect on the community. I have to make the case that 9 years on the school board, going on 10, causes you to really appreciate the diversity of this town. We talk a lot about diversity, income diversity, cultural diversity, racial diversity, etc. But it is so valuable to everything that we do, including to all of our children, the 3,000 children that go to our schools. Not only has that been withering away over time, but this singular event of the reassessment of our tax bills is a paradigm shift, and is causing a sudden threat to the diversity we've always had. Really additionally got my attention. I said, something must be done. Then talking with Mr. Floyd and Mr. Firestone, I said, what can I do? There are things that are causing this to happen, and by the way, I am convinced, as they are, the more data you see, the more you're concerned that either the process was flawed, if not, it was inapplicable to the Princetons as we know them, or it was seriously underperformed on. They didn't use a process that was promised.
One of the things that I found in this article that interested me is that this group that was picked to do it gave the lowest bid, that they were picked because they gave the lowest bid. So you kind of wonder, what does that mean? Why did they give the lowest bid? And I know that's worth exploring in itself, because is it, and you're right, the questions you're raising as well, is the flaw in the process? Is it in the numbers? Or is there unintended consequences of other types of policies that involve? I see, for example, your perfect storm, if you broaden it to the national level, you see that this is a time when people losing jobs, high unemployment, people losing homes, the mortgage crisis, all of these things going on all around the country. And now you have a situation, here is a small world, if you want to look at it that way, and take those factors and add to that these things going on within Princeton, and you realize that compounds it. It makes it even worse because of the particular economic
It creates a perfect environment for the deficiencies and results that we see.
Exactly.
And let me give you another word or two to that. First, ASI, Appraisal Systems, I would expect is a competent firm. They've done lots of these, but they are the lowest bidder, and by law, the contract had to go to the lowest bidder. You really have your hands on it. I learned that. It's part of the school system too. However, in the case of Princeton, you really have a very small sample size. We are not a large city or town with lots of residential or commercial units. So sample size, when you're looking at comparables, is important. Secondly, unlike any other town, perhaps in New Jersey, you have an order of magnitude difference from the lowest price house to the highest price. We will have a $300,000 or $400,000 residence and a $3 or $4 million up to an $8 or $10 million residence. The small sample size, coupled with a very large variation in property value, negates much of the work that their process would have applied to. And then finally, and I challenged everybody at the meeting last week, go to the Appraisal Systems website, Appraisal Systems Incorporated. They have a 34-page PowerPoint presentation on the process.
Their
Very
particular
detailed.
process
The
that they
process
did
that they contracted to perform to. They didn't do that at our
they didn't do what they said they
They
had done
did
on
not
the website.
come close to doing what
I
they
see.
promised to do by virtue of their website.
Wow.
So that
Yeah.
all comes together as a pretty tough situation.
Right. Well, you know, I know you've been working on this, all of you have been working on this for quite a while, and I know, Jim, that you've implied that you have a direction you want to take now. Where do you see this going? How do you see, now we know the problem exists, now we have some documentation of it. You've talked to families who've told you what's happened to their lives, or will happen to their lives as a result of that. You have good data on that. So where do you see yourself taking this problem?
Well, where it essentially has to go is it has to either go to being rectified and taken care of over the next year's time, which is what the council sort of suggests and the township committee suggests is the proper way of handling it. The assessor getting together with parts of our community, working with neighborhoods to change it. But unfortunately, that's after the fact that a lot of people are going to be seriously hurt by this.
The damage will have been done.
The damage will
That's
have been
what I'm
done,
saying, right.
and also some people will not want to give up the gains they've made by lowering their taxes.
True.
So we've asked Borough Council just last week, we said, give us at least a disclaimer that something's flawed here, that something's wrong, so that the people understand that next year when things are redone, if they're going to get redone, at least the door is left open for people to realize they may have to go up in their taxes. Otherwise, you will never get that to happen. But more important than that, I think that we'd all like to see this whole thing turned over. This thing doesn't make any sense. This thing is seriously flawed. And if it continues, then we have to end up going to court over it. And we are prepared to go to court if we have to. We've prepared ourselves for that eventuality, and there are people with us who will do that. So we want their attention focused on the problem, the Borough Council and the Township Committee, and we want them to acknowledge that a problem exists.
Yes.
So far, they haven't done that, which infuriates you.
And you would understand, Joan, and part of the impetus here is if this revaluation stands, we live with it for the next 10 or 13 years.
Ouch.
So now is the time to see that it is proper.
Really, you know, people have come up to me when they know that I was going to do this show, and they said, "Oh, we may have to move away." I hear this a lot, you know,
Sure.
and you probably
As do
heard
we,
a lot.
right.
Yeah, we'll have to move away. We can't stay here anymore. And some think, you know, my heart drops when I hear this because it begins to sound like it's not just a problem with numbers; it's a problem with intention, and that's when it begins to be very, very troubling. What's happening here? Where are we going? Are we trying to upscale these areas and ease people away? I mean, what's really happening?
Jim's
Joan, let me just speak a bit to that. The earlier meetings that included the elected officials, the residents in the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood were virtually fluffed off, is the only way I can put it, with such statements as, the county approved it, so it also has our imprimatur. There's nothing more we can do. And at that stage of the game, many in those meetings felt that not only were they not forthcoming in answers, many felt that they didn't even understand the process themselves. And then I think the most dastardly thing in the minds of a lot of our neighbors was the fact that they felt it was really discriminatory. They wouldn't even listen to a fairly accomplished elected official at least say, let me look into it. We didn't even get that in the neighborhood. It was a discounting. Well, this aroused the ire of the neighbors, but to their credit, they did not take on an incendiary position and said, well, let's find out what's happening generically. And hence the work that Jim's done and others and Alan coming forth. It is systemic across the Princetons, and in our opinion, either in error, wrong, and not what was described as an anomaly when they were talking to the Witherspoon Jackson folk.
Like a little accident of some kind.
Yeah. Not even to say, maybe there's an error. We use the term anomaly.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's town-wide. That's
Oh,
what Jim's
absolutely.
saying. It's
That's my
absolutely
point.
town-wide, and that's what the court looks for.
Yeah.
The court looks for, is this all the way across the boundaries of your town? Do you find pockets of this all over your town, like you have a disease as a result of it?
Right. It's a pattern.
And yes, we do need a second opinion. Even when I talked to a doctor, he said, my house got hit by it. He said if it were us docs, we'd ask for a second opinion at least.
That's right.
But an
That's right.
independent second opinion, not
Okay.
just one that's picked
Right.
arbitrarily.
So we only have a minute or so left. Can you just say where do you want people to go with this? Where do you think, September's coming very soon. What do you want, what's your goal for September in addressing this? What do you want to-
Call us and talk to us
Okay.
about your problems in your neighborhood.
Okay.
You may have to help out your assessor eventually, but only by knowing the problems in your neighborhood is this going to happen. And after that, join in with us because we are there, and we will work. We'll work with everybody who's called. They're coming together as a group.
I would only add to that, there's a two-phase problem here. One is the immediate short term. Tax bills are due September and November.
Okay.
Ones that we're not being prepared for. Come forward and tell us or their town officials if in fact they're in trouble. The
Okay.
second one is the longer term issue.
Okay, so you have deadlines and you have things, and people should at least get in touch with you. Let's get a big documentation on what's happening here. The groundswell is very impressive. It shows you we still have a democracy, in case we're wondering about it. I'm sorry we have to stop our discussion now, and of course there's so much more to talk about. Let me just explain that for my next show, and this might interest you, Alan, I'm going to focus on what's happening with education. How did robots become more valued than teachers? And I have been an educator for a very long time, so I feel very strongly about that. And then at the Princeton Public Library, I do a program called Talking Politics, and I will be discussing a book I wrote and edited called The Politics of Offshore Oil on September 15th, Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. It's open to the community, and everyone is welcome to come. Thank you so much for sharing with me. It's frustrating in a way because there's so much to talk about. You've had so many meetings you've attended. You know, you're filled with this problem, but just feel good about the fact that you stood up and spoke, and you stood up and you're doing what concerned citizens should be doing in our society. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for the
Thank you
opportunity.
very much.
Thank you.